She thought her privilege would protect her, but when she slapped a stranger in the parking lot, things took an unexpected turn she never saw coming. Watch her shocking downfall unfold. Michael Jennings pulled into a packed grocery store parking lot, weaving through the rows and watching for an open space. It was Saturday afternoon, prime shopping time, and the lot was crowded with families and individuals hustling in and out, carts full and kids tugging at sleeves. Just as he was starting to think he'd have to park far off, he spotted an empty spot close to the entrance, a lucky find. He slowly pulled his car in, careful to center it between the lines. He turned off the engine and took a breath, glad he'd found a spot so close. But as soon as he opened his door, the screech of tires cut through the air, breaking the hum of parking lot chatter. He glanced over to see a white SUV pull up aggressively right next to him. The driver, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a clenched jaw, stared him down from behind her window. Before he could process the situation, she rolled down her window, her face contorted with anger, and shouted, "Hey, that was my spot!" Michael blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't noticed anyone waiting when he pulled in. He tried to gather himself, not wanting to overreact. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his voice steady and polite. He hadn't done anything wrong, but her intensity was hard to ignore. The woman slammed her door shut, striding over to him, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I was waiting for that spot," she spat, her tone sharp and filled with accusation. "I had my blinker on. You just stole it right out from under me." Michael took a deep breath, trying to maintain his calm. "I didn't see you," he replied, keeping his voice even. "The space was empty when I got here." "Oh, of course you didn't see me," she sneered, her tone laced with sarcasm. "People like you never notice anyone else, do you?" Michael felt a familiar tension rise in his chest. He knew exactly what she meant by "people like you." He'd been through enough situations like this to recognize the coded language, the barely veiled hostility. He took another breath, reminding himself not to let her words get to him. "Look," he said, staying as calm as he could. "I'm just here to get some groceries. It's only a parking spot." But his calmness seemed to only fuel her anger. She took a step closer, her face inches from his, her finger raised like she was ready to drive her point home. "Don't you talk to me like that," she hissed. "People like you think you can just do whatever you want, like the rules don't apply to you." Michael's jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. He could feel the tension growing, the weight of her words pressing down. He knew there were a few people nearby watching, glancing over with curiosity as her voice rose. He didn't want to make a scene, but her words were digging deep. "Ma'am," he said, his tone steady but with an edge. "I'm just trying to do my shopping. Let's leave it at that." But she wasn't backing down. She scoffed, looking him up and down as if he were something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "Trouble. That's what people like you are, nothing but trouble. Showing up in places you don't belong, thinking you're entitled to whatever you want." She took another step closer, her voice lowering. "I bet you don't even live around here, do you?" Each word she threw at him hit like a slap. Michael took a slow breath, feeling the anger simmer inside him, his patience starting to wear thin. He hadn't done a single thing wrong, yet here he was, standing in front of a stranger who seemed determined to make him feel unwelcome, to treat him like he didn't belong. It was the same, tired story, the same assumptions, and the same feeling of being judged without reason. For a moment he thought about just walking past her, ignoring her insults, letting her stand there fuming alone. But something about her, the sharpness of her tone, the way she looked at him like he was less than her, made him pause. "Look," he said firmly, "it's just a parking spot. I didn't see you waiting. That's all there is to it." She let out a bitter laugh. "Of course that's all there is to it for you. You wouldn't understand. People like you think the world owes you everything." Her voice was loud enough that a few heads turned, people staring, some pretending not to notice. She seemed to enjoy the attention, smirking at him like she had the upper hand, as if he were the one who needed to back down. Michael could feel his anger rising, the frustration building up with every insult she threw his way. He knew what she wanted, a reaction, something she could twist and use against him. But he kept his fists clenched at his sides, refusing to let her win, refusing to let her see the frustration and anger she was stirring up inside him. He looked at her calmly, though the storm was brewing within him, and said, "I don't know what your problem is, but I'm not going to argue with you over a parking spot." Her eyes flashed, her smirk fading. "Oh, I'm not done with you yet," she hissed, stepping closer, her voice low and threatening. "Not by a long shot." Michael stood his ground, his eyes steady on her as he tried to stay calm. But the woman's anger was like a wave, crashing over him, relentless and growing with each word. He could see something in her expression, something fierce and smug, like she was enjoying pushing him, daring him to respond. "I don't know what you're hoping to get out of this," he said, his voice firm but calm. "But I'm not going to argue with you." She let out a mocking laugh, stepping even closer. "Oh, I know you're kind," she sneered, her voice lowering to a sharp whisper. "You think you can do whatever you want, don't you? Think you can just show up, take up space that isn't yours, and act like you're entitled to everything? Well, not here, not with me." Michael felt his fists clench, but he forced himself to stay steady, reminding himself not to react. "It's just a parking spot," he replied slowly, his voice controlled. "Nothing more." "Nothing more?" she snapped, eyes flashing. "It's everything. It's people like you, thinking you don't have to follow the rules, that you can just do whatever you want." He took a steadying breath, looking at her and refusing to let her words hit as deep as she intended. But he could feel the frustration welling up inside him, bubbling beneath the surface. He'd dealt with people like her before, people who saw nothing wrong with using their entitlement to belittle others. But each time, it left him feeling raw, as if their words stripped away something he couldn't quite get back. He looked around, noticing that more people were watching now, a few openly staring, while others pretended to look at their phones or shopping lists. He could feel their curiosity, the weight of their assumptions pressing on him. He knew what it looked like, a confrontation in a parking lot, and he was the one she'd painted as the aggressor without even knowing him. "Look," he said, his voice lower now. "I don't know you. I don't know why you're so upset over this, but I suggest you calm down." She bristled, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, don't you dare tell me to calm down," she hissed, her voice rising again. "You don't get to tell me what to do. Not here, not ever. You think you're so much better than everyone else? You think the rules don't apply to you?" Michael clenched his jaw, fighting to keep his tone measured. "I didn't say that. I just parked my car." She scoffed, looking him over with disdain. "Sure, people like you think you can just take and take, never caring about anyone else. It's disgusting." He took a deep breath, the tension in his chest growing with each insult. He wanted to walk away, to ignore her and let her rant herself into exhaustion. But her words kept digging deeper, each one a reminder of moments like this, of times when he'd had to keep his head down, say nothing, let people like her have the last word. But this time, something was different. He felt his patience slipping, the frustration and exhaustion bubbling to the surface. Her words weren't just about a parking space. They were about something else, something she didn't even try to hide, a belief that he didn't belong, that he was somehow beneath her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice sharper than before, "I suggest you walk away before this gets out of hand." But she just smirked, taking another step closer. "You think you can scare me?" she taunted, her voice dripping with contempt. "I'm not afraid of you. People like you don't scare me." The word people lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Michael could feel the anger twisting inside him, a reaction he'd tried so hard to hold back. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction, didn't want to let her know she was getting under his skin. But the hate in her eyes, the satisfaction she took in trying to make him feel small, it was almost unbearable. "I'm not here to scare anyone," he said quietly, his fists clenched at his sides. "But I don't have to stand here and take this from you." Her smirk grew, and she raised her voice, making sure everyone could hear. "You think you're entitled to everything, don't you?" she shouted, her voice filled with rage. Well, I've had enough of it." Then, without warning, she stepped forward and shoved him hard in the chest, her hand hitting with more force than he expected. Michael stumbled back a step, catching himself before he lost his balance. He looked at her in shock, his patience hanging by a thread, his body tense as he struggled to keep control. "What is wrong with you?" he snapped, his voice louder now, his calm veneer cracking. "Oh, there it is," she said, a twisted smile on her face. "That temper, I knew it was there." She looked around at the crowd that had gathered, her voice rising even more. "You all see this? You see how he's acting?" Michael clenched his fists, the frustration boiling inside him. He wanted to walk away, but he knew what she wanted. Knew she was baiting him, trying to force him to react so she could turn it against him. But her shove, her words, the way she looked at him like he was less than human, it was all pushing him past his limit. "You don't get to put your hands on me," he said, his voice low but seething. "This is your last warning." But she didn't back down. Instead, she leaned in, her voice a harsh whisper meant only for him. "Oh, I'll do whatever I want," she said. "And you? You're just going to have to stand there and take it." Michael looked around, seeing the bystanders watching with open eyes and cameras raised. Every part of him wanted to walk away, but he knew this woman wouldn't stop, wouldn't back down. She wanted to see him react, to turn him into the villain. But as he stared her down, he knew he was no longer willing to just take it. Michael held her gaze, his patience hanging by a thread. He could feel every nerve in his body tense, the frustration churning inside him. He tried to tell himself to stay calm, to walk away, but her words and the smug look on her face made it nearly impossible. He could see the twisted satisfaction in her eyes, as if she were waiting for him to snap, eager to turn the situation against him. "Look," he said, his voice strained but still controlled. "I'm done here. I'm not going to stand here and let you treat me like this." He turned to leave, hoping she would let him go. But as he turned, she reached out, grabbing his shoulder, spinning him back to face her. Her face was red with anger, her eyes wide and wild. "Don't you dare walk away from me," she shouted, her voice echoing across the parking lot. Then, without warning, she raised her hand and slapped him across the face. The sound was sharp, a crack that seemed to hang in the air, freezing everything around them. Michael's head snapped to the side, the sting radiating through his cheek. But the shock was greater than the pain. The world felt silent for a moment, as he processed what had just happened. This wasn't just a slap. It was a statement, a way for her to assert her dominance, to make him feel small, to show him that she thought he was powerless. Michael's mind raced, each thought a tangle of anger, frustration, and disbelief. He knew he could walk away, knew he could just ignore her and go on with his day, but the sting of her hand on his face, the humiliation, the public display of disrespect, it all bubbled up inside him, a fire he couldn't ignore. For the first time, he met her gaze with an intensity she hadn't expected. Her smug expression faltered, her eyes widening as she took a step back. She hadn't anticipated that he'd stand his ground, hadn't expected him to look at her with such calm defiance. Michael didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out. Instead, he lifted his hand and returned the slap, not with the same force, but enough to make it clear that he wouldn't be her victim. His slap was controlled, deliberate, a line in the sand. The crowd around them seemed to gasp collectively, the tension in the air snapping like a taut rope. The woman stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek, her face twisting with shock and outrage. For a second, there was nothing but silence as everyone held their breath, watching the scene unfold. You hit me," she shrieked, her voice rising in disbelief. She pointed at him, her fingers shaking, her voice sharp and filled with venom. "You animal! You're going to pay for this! Do you know who I am?" Her voice grew louder, the words coming out in frantic bursts. "I'll ruin you!" she screamed, her face contorted with rage. "You think you can just put your hands on me? I'll ruin you!" Michael stood there, his chest heaving, his body tense as he tried to keep his emotions in check. He'd barely touched her, but now she was using every ounce of drama she could muster. twisting the story, making herself look like the victim. It was a performance, one meant to turn the crowd against him, to make him seem like the aggressor. "Someone call the police," she shouted, looking around wildly, her voice high and panicked. "He assaulted me. This thug just attacked me out of nowhere." Michael felt a rush of dread as he saw people pulling out their phones, some already dialing, others recording. He knew what this could look like if someone took a snapshot of this moment, if they only saw her frantic performance without the context of everything that had come before. He'd seen it happen to others, seen how quickly the story could turn against people like him, how easily the truth could be buried. Taking a step back, he kept his voice calm but firm, refusing to let her see his fear. "You hit me first," he said, his voice steady. "I don't want any trouble. You brought this on yourself." But she sneered, her face twisting even more. "Oh, you think you're so innocent?" She spat, looking around, appealing to the crowd. "Did you all see that? Did you see how he hit me?" The crowd murmured, some people whispering to each other, others looking at him with judgment, uncertainty. The bystanders' reactions varied. Some seemed sympathetic, while others looked on with suspicion, their expressions unreadable. The weight of their gazes was heavy, each one like a silent accusation, a reminder of how quickly things could turn. Michael clenched his fists, feeling the frustration rise again. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction, didn't want to let her control the narrative, but he also knew that anything he said could be twisted, could be used against him. It was a lose-lose situation, one he knew all too well. And then, just when he thought it couldn't get worse, he heard someone from the crowd saying, "Call the cops. Let them sort this out." The woman's eyes lit up, a satisfied smirk crossing her face as she realized she'd gotten exactly what she wanted. Michael felt his heart race, a chill settling over him. He knew what was coming, knew that this was about to escalate beyond his control. And as he looked at her, still clutching her cheek, still playing the victim, he realized that this was far from over. Michael took a steadying breath, watching as a few people in the crowd dialed their phones, murmuring into them as they described the scene unfolding before them. He could feel the weight of the situation settling heavily over him, the tension in the air pressing down as he tried to keep calm. The woman, her face red with anger and indignation, continued to clutch her cheek, making a spectacle of herself, feeding off the attention she'd created. "You see this?" she shouted, pointing at Michael with a trembling finger. "This man just attacked me out of nowhere. I was just trying to get my parking spot and he went crazy." Michael felt a pang of frustration and disbelief at her words. He hadn't done a single thing wrong. He'd parked, minding his own business. But here he was, facing a woman who had twisted the entire situation to make herself the victim, using every advantage she had to turn people against him. He glanced around, noticing that a few people were watching him with skeptical eyes, while others exchanged uncertain glances. He could feel the judgment radiating from some of them, as though they'd already decided he was guilty based solely on her performance. And then, as he listened to her accusations, he heard the faint wail of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The knot in his stomach tightened. He knew how this could play out. He'd seen it before, heard too many stories of innocent people put in impossible situations, judged before they had a chance to explain. And now, here he was, standing at the center of one of those stories, facing accusations he didn't deserve. As the police car pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing, the crowd parted, giving the officers a clear view of Michael and the woman. Two officers stepped out of the car, their expressions serious as they took in the scene, their eyes shifting between the woman and Michael, assessing the situation. Before they could speak, the woman rushed forward, her face a mask of fear and distress. "Officers," she cried, her voice filled with feigned panic. "Thank goodness you're here. This man attacked me. I was just trying to park and he slapped me out of nowhere. I was so scared. He could have done anything." One of the officers held up his hand, his gaze steady as he looked at her, silently signaling for her to pause. He then turned his attention to Michael, his expression unreadable but firm. "Sir, we need to hear your side of the story," the officer said, his voice calm but authoritative. Michael took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to gather his thoughts. This was his chance to tell the truth, to make it clear that he hadn't instigated anything, that he was simply defending himself. He looked the officer in the eye, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Officer, I parked my car in this spot," he began, gesturing toward his vehicle. She came up afterward, accusing me of taking her spot. She started yelling, getting in my face. I tried to walk away, but she wouldn't let it go. Then she hit me first. I only defended myself when she attacked. The officer nodded, listening intently. He glanced back at the woman whose face had hardened, her eyes narrowing as she tried to hold on to the role of the victim. "Ma'am," the officer said, turning back to her, "is it true that you initiated physical contact first?" She scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. "Of course not. He's just saying that to cover himself. I was defending myself. I felt threatened and I reacted. He's twisting everything to make me look bad." At that moment, a voice spoke up from the crowd. "Officer, I've got the whole thing on video," said a man, stepping forward with his phone held out. "I saw everything. She was the one who started it, yelling and getting in his face. He didn't do anything until she slapped him first." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a silent communication passing between them as they took in this new piece of evidence. The first officer turned to the man, nodding in acknowledgement. "Sir, can we see the footage?" The bystander nodded, holding out his phone so the officers could review the video. As they watched, Michael could feel a surge of relief building in his chest, a small light cutting through the darkness of the moment. This video was proof, something that couldn't be twisted or reinterpreted to suit the woman's narrative. It was the truth, captured in real time, and it might just be enough to protect him. The officers' faces were calm but serious as they watched the video, and as they finished, the first officer looked up, his gaze now focused squarely on the woman. "Ma'am, based on this footage, it appears that you were the first to initiate physical contact. You were the one who escalated this situation." The woman's face turned pale, her confident sneer replaced with shock and indignation. "What? You're going to believe that? He's lying, and so is that man. They're all just trying to gang up on me." The officer remained unfazed, his expression unchanging. "Ma'am, the footage is clear. We need you to come with us for further questioning." A ripple went through the crowd as the officer's words sank in, the onlookers exchanging glances, their initial judgments shifting as they realized the truth of the situation. Even those who had sided with the woman seemed to reconsider, a sense of discomfort and embarrassment spreading as they processed the scene. The woman's face twisted with anger, her eyes flashing as she looked between Michael and the officers. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked, her voice high-pitched and trembling with rage. "You're really going to take his side over mine? Don't you know who I am?" The officers remained calm, undeterred by her outburst. One of them gently took her by the arm, guiding her toward the police car. "Ma'am, please cooperate. We're only doing our job." Michael watched as they led her away, her protests growing louder, each word dripping with disbelief and resentment. He felt a surge of relief but also a lingering tension, a reminder of how close he'd come to losing control of the narrative, of how quickly everything could have turned against him. And as the officers closed the door, her voice muffled behind the glass, Michael took a slow breath, the weight of the situation finally starting to lift. He knew that today's events would stay with him, a reminder of the fragile line he walked every day, a line between being seen as a person and being judged as something less. For now, at least, he had found some sense of justice, some reassurance that the truth had won out. But he also knew that this was just one battle in a much larger, ongoing struggle. A struggle he would face again and again. As the police car pulled away, Michael stood alone in the parking lot, the noise of the crowd fading into a quiet murmur. People around him were beginning to disperse, some offering him sympathetic nods, others casting him curious glances as they went back to their shopping. The intense scene had passed, but the tension still lingered in the air, thick and uncomfortable. He took a deep breath, letting the weight of what had just happened settle over him. The anger, the frustration, the fear. All of it was still there, simmering beneath the surface. He'd felt the sting of her words, the humiliation of her slap, and the judgment of the crowd. And though he had stood his ground, it had left him exhausted. In so many ways, he'd simply wanted a quiet day, a simple shopping trip, a moment of peace that now felt like a distant memory. He looked around, catching sight of the man who had recorded the incident. The bystander met his gaze, giving him a small, respectful nod. He walked over, his phone lowered now, but the serious expression still on his face. "Hey, man," the guy said, his voice calm and understanding. "I'm sorry you had to go through all that. People like her, they just think they can get away with anything." Michael managed a small, appreciative smile. "Thanks. You don't know how much it helped to have someone there to back me up. Without that video..." He let his words trail off, not wanting to think about what might have happened if no one had stepped in. The man shrugged, slipping his phone into his pocket. "It was the right thing to do. We've all seen too much of this kind of thing, you know. It's about time someone gets held accountable." He paused, looking at Michael with genuine empathy. "Take care of yourself, all right?" "Thank you," Michael said sincerely. "Really, thank you." They shared a moment of understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the reality they both knew too well. And as the man walked away, disappearing back into the crowd, Michael felt a mix of gratitude and exhaustion settle over him. He was thankful for the support, for the proof that had kept him safe today. But he was also painfully aware of how quickly the situation could have spiraled, how easily her lies could have turned his world upside down. As he stood there, letting the last remnants of the crowd disperse, Michael replayed her words in his mind. "I'll ruin you," she had said, each word filled with venom. She had believed she held all the power, that she could twist the story however she wanted, and that people would take her side without question. And for a moment, she had almost succeeded. He felt the anger simmering again, a slow burn deep in his chest. Her entitlement, her willingness to use her privilege to belittle him, to strip away his dignity without a second thought. It all weighed on him. He had done nothing wrong, yet she had tried to reduce him to nothing more than a stereotype, someone she could push around to satisfy her own sense of superiority. Michael took a long, deep breath, grounding himself, feeling the cool air ease the tightness in his chest. He knew he couldn't let her words hold power over him, couldn't let her actions define his day or his sense of self. Today had been a reminder, a painful one, but also a lesson in resilience, a moment where he'd chosen not to back down. As he turned back to his car, he noticed a few people watching him, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. He knew what they saw, a man caught in a situation he hadn't asked for, forced to defend his own humanity in front of strangers. But he also knew they had seen him stand up for himself, refuse to be silenced, even when everything seemed stacked against him. He got into his car, closing the door and sitting for a moment in the quiet, letting the stillness wash over him. The weight of the encounter felt heavy, but there was also a sense of relief, a realization that he'd come through it without losing himself. He had held onto his dignity, his strength, and his integrity, even in the face of her hate. As he rested his hands on the steering wheel, he allowed himself a small, weary smile. It hadn't been easy, and he knew it wouldn't be the last time he faced something like this. But today, he'd chosen to stand his ground, and in doing so, he had reclaimed a piece of himself, a reminder that his worth wasn't defined by anyone else's ignorance or prejudice. Starting the engine, Michael took one last look around the parking lot, letting the scene settle into a memory. And as he pulled out, driving away from the place where everything had unfolded, he felt a renewed sense of determination. This was his life, his journey, and he wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how entitled or hateful, take that away from him. The drive home was quiet, the low hum of the engine and the soft rustle of the wind through his open window his only companions. The events of the day replayed in his mind, each detail sharp and clear, as if he were watching it all happen again. He felt the sting of her slap, the tension in her voice, the weight of the crowd's eyes on him, all layered over his attempts to stay calm, to hold on to his dignity. It was a memory that would take time to fade, if it ever did. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel as he navigated through his neighborhood, past rows of houses that had become so familiar to him over the years. Each house, each tree-lined street represented a sense of belonging, a place he had come to call his own. And yet, today's encounter had reminded him that, in the eyes of some, he was always just a step away from being an outsider, a target for prejudice and assumptions that he could never escape. He stopped at a red light, glancing at his own reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was calm, his eyes steady, but he could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the quiet frustration simmering beneath the surface. He had managed to hold himself together, but the cost was visible, a weariness that went beyond physical tiredness, a weight that came from years of silent battles, from having to prove his worth over and over again. The woman's words echoed in his mind, sharp and biting. "I'll ruin you." She had said it with such confidence, such certainty, as if her mere words could erase his existence, strip him of his rights. She had believed herself powerful enough to destroy him with a lie, to bend reality to her will, and that realization left him with a bitter taste. He thought back to his mother's voice, the countless lessons she had instilled in him about staying composed, about keeping his head high no matter the situation. She had taught him to walk with dignity, to let his actions speak louder than his anger. "Don't give them the power to see you break," she would say. "They only win if they see you fall." Michael sighed, feeling a mix of frustration and gratitude. He'd learned to master that control, to hold his emotions in check, but today had tested him like few things had before. He had felt his patience fray, felt the edges of his calm begin to unravel, and yet somehow he had held on. He had refused to let her break him, to let her turn him into the caricature she had wanted him to be. The light turned green, and he eased forward, his thoughts turning to the bystander who had stepped in, the man who had offered him a lifeline just when he needed it most. That recording had been his saving grace, the truth captured on a screen that could not be twisted or distorted. Michael felt a wave of gratitude for that stranger, for his decision to speak up, to lend his voice to a story that could have so easily gone the other way. But even as he appreciated the support, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. Why had it taken a stranger's intervention to protect his truth? Why did he need evidence to validate his own innocence, his own right to stand in that parking lot without fear of being seen as a threat? It was a question he had wrestled with before, and he knew there were no easy answers. Turning onto his street, Michael let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to ease as he approached home. The familiarity of his neighborhood, the comfort of his house waiting just ahead, gave him a sense of relief, a reminder that this was his space, his sanctuary. Here he didn't have to defend himself, didn't have to prove his worth to anyone. Pulling into the driveway, he parked and turned off the engine, sitting for a moment in the quiet stillness of his car. The day had taken its toll, and he felt the weight of it settle over him, heavy and lingering. But he also felt something else, a quiet pride, a sense of resilience that came from knowing he had faced the storm and hadn't let it break him. He had held his ground, had refused to be defined by her accusations or her anger. He had chosen to stand up for himself, even when the world around him seemed poised to turn against him. And as he sat there, breathing in the familiar scent of his car, he felt a small, weary smile cross his face. Michael stepped out, locking the door and grabbing his grocery bags, the simple weight of them grounding him in the present moment. Today had tested him, had pushed him to the edge of his patience and composure, but he had come out stronger, reminded of the strength he carried within himself. As he walked up to his front door, he allowed himself to let go of the day's events, to leave behind the anger and frustration. He had faced what needed to be faced, and now he was home, ready to find a sense of peace in the familiarity of his own space. Michael stepped through his front door, closing it gently behind him, the soft click echoing in the quiet of his home. The air inside was cool and calm, untouched by the tension and chaos that had filled his day. He set the grocery bags down on the kitchen counter, his mind slowly easing back into the rhythm of the present, away from the anger and frustration he had carried from the parking lot. He stood still for a moment, letting the silence wrap around him, a quiet balm for the turmoil he'd endured. Here he felt safe, untouchable. The walls of his home had witnessed his best and worst moments, sheltering him from a world that too often looked at him through a distorted lens. Today had been no different, another painful reminder of the prejudice he faced, but in this space he was free from judgment. Michael began unpacking his groceries, each item placed deliberately in its spot, a simple task that helped center him, grounding him in the small comforts of routine. A carton of milk, a loaf of bread, a pack of eggs. Ordinary things, things that made him feel normal again. Each item was a small reminder that despite the events of the day, he was still here, still moving forward, still living his life on his own terms. He reached for his phone, setting it on the counter as he absent-mindedly scrolled through his messages. There were a few texts from friends and family, reminders of a gathering next weekend, questions about work, the mundane exchanges of daily life that suddenly felt like anchors, pulling him back to reality, away from the ugliness he'd encountered. He paused, his finger hovering over a message from his mother. It was from earlier in the day, just a simple, "Hope you're doing well, love you." Michael felt a warmth spread through him, a small reminder of the support he carried with him, even when he was alone. His mother had always been his rock, a voice of wisdom and strength, teaching him to carry himself with pride, to never let anyone take away his dignity. He remembered her words, spoken so many times over the years. No one has the power to define who you are. That's something only you can do. Today, he'd held on to that lesson, had let it guide him as he faced down a stranger's anger and entitlement. He had refused to be pushed aside, to be reduced by her narrow, hateful perspective. He set his phone down, feeling a renewed sense of clarity. Yes, the day had tested him, had threatened to pull him into a spiral of frustration and resentment, but he had chosen to stand firm, to hold on to the truth of who he was, regardless of her attempts to strip that away. That choice, simple as it seemed, felt like a victory, a small triumph over a world that too often wanted to make him feel small. Michael poured himself a glass of water, taking a long sip as he leaned against the counter, staring out the kitchen window. The evening light was soft, casting a warm glow over his backyard, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of the parking lot, and he felt himself finally start to relax, the tension in his body beginning to ease. As he looked out at the familiar landscape, he thought back to the bystander who had stepped forward, the man who had recorded the incident and spoken up on his behalf. It was a reminder that, while there were people like that woman who would try to tear him down, there were also those willing to stand by him, to see him for who he truly was. Michael felt a deep gratitude for that stranger, for his choice to do the right thing when it would have been easy to simply walk away. It was a small act, but it had made all the difference, and it reminded Michael that even in a world filled with prejudice, there was still room for compassion, for truth, for justice. He took another sip, feeling the coolness of the water soothe him, each breath growing easier, lighter. Today had shown him the ugliness of ignorance, but it had also shown him the strength of resilience, the power of standing up for himself, of refusing to be silenced. It was a quiet strength, one he carried with him, rooted deep within, unshaken by the opinions or judgments of others. Finally, he pushed himself away from the counter, moving to the living room and sinking into his favorite armchair. He let out a long, slow breath, his body finally relaxing fully, the last of the day's weight slipping from his shoulders. He closed his eyes, letting the quiet fill him, a sense of peace settling over him like a warm blanket. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own tests. But for tonight, he was here, in his own space, surrounded by the things that grounded him, the memories and comforts that reminded him of who he was. and that, he knew, was something no one could ever take away from him. In the silence, he found solace, a calm acceptance that, despite the struggles he faced, he would continue forward, stronger and more resolute than before. And with that thought, he finally allowed himself to let go, the events of the day fading into the background as he embraced the peace he had fought so hard to hold on to. Michael sat quietly in his armchair, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall filling the stillness of the room. The events of the day had left him drained, but here, in his sanctuary, he could finally let himself unwind. He felt the tension slowly leaving his body, as if his home itself was absorbing the remnants of frustration and exhaustion that clung to him. The sky outside was beginning to darken, the last streaks of daylight casting a soft amber glow through the window. He watched as the colors faded, replaced by the cool, quiet tones of evening, a gentle reminder that today was finally coming to an end. He let out a slow breath, grateful for the calmness that settled over him. Today's confrontation was one of many he'd faced over the years, a painful reminder that, even in simple moments, prejudice could creep in, souring what should have been an ordinary day. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him and made assumptions, cast judgments without knowing him. And while he had always managed to handle it with grace and control, it never got easier. The weight of those assumptions, the harshness of those encounters, they built up over time, each one leaving a small mark that never quite faded. Michael's gaze drifted to a family photo on the shelf across the room, taken during a family reunion years ago. He could see the faces of his parents, their expressions full of pride, their arms around him and his siblings. His parents had taught him strength, resilience, the importance of carrying himself with dignity no matter what. They had faced their own battles, the prejudices and barriers of their time, and they had instilled in him the same resolve, the same belief in his own worth. He thought back to his father's voice, his calm, steady wisdom guiding him through childhood and adolescence, always reminding him to hold his head high. "Son," his father would say, "there's always going to be people who want to see you stumble, but you know who you are. Don't let anyone tell you different." Those words, spoken so many years ago, had been a lifeline today. They had anchored him, given him the strength to stand his ground, even when the world around him had seemed ready to turn against him. And as he sat here now, in the quiet of his home, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons his parents had passed down, for the resilience they had given him. He shifted in his seat, his thoughts turning to the stranger in the parking lot, the bystander who had filmed the confrontation, who had spoken up when it mattered most. That man's choice to intervene, to offer his support, had been unexpected but powerful. In a moment when Michael could have been left vulnerable and alone, this stranger had seen the truth and chosen to stand by it. It was a reminder, Michael realized, that compassion was still alive, that even in difficult times, there were people willing to step up, to show solidarity. His gratitude for that man was immense. It was because of him that the woman's lies hadn't succeeded, that he was able to tell his side of the story without fear. That act of kindness, small but significant, had turned the tide in a way that words alone could not have. In the soft light of evening, Michael felt his heart grow a little lighter. Today had been tough, but he had found support in an unexpected place, had been reminded that, while prejudice and ignorance existed, so did empathy and courage. The thought brought him a quiet sense of hope, a belief that he wasn't alone in his struggles. The room was darkening as the last rays of sunlight faded, and Michael leaned back, allowing himself to rest, feeling the day's emotions settle into a calm acceptance. He knew that the world wouldn't change overnight, that people like the woman in the parking lot would continue to exist. But he also knew that he had the strength to face them, to stand firm in his truth, just as his parents had taught him. And with that realization, he felt a renewed sense of peace, a quiet resolve that tomorrow was a new day, one he would greet with the same resilience and dignity that had carried him through today. Don't miss out on how this story ends. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment like this. Drop a comment with your thoughts below. As the last light faded from the sky, Michael moved from his armchair to the kitchen, ready to unwind with a quiet dinner. The soft glow of the kitchen light spilled over the countertop as he prepared his meal, each movement a simple but soothing ritual. Chopping vegetables, stirring the pot, setting the table. It was all a welcome contrast to the chaotic energy of the day. He placed his dinner on the table, a simple plate of pasta with a fresh salad on the side, and sat down, letting himself enjoy the quiet moment. The day had taken so much from him emotionally, but this small act of self-care felt grounding, a way of reminding himself that he deserved peace, calm, and respect, even if the world around him didn't always recognize it. As he ate, his thoughts drifted back to the parking lot, the woman's face twisted with anger, her words sharp and cutting. The frustration was still there, simmering just below the surface, but as he took each bite, he allowed himself to let go a little more, to release the tension piece by piece. This was his time, his space, and he didn't need to carry her words into his evening. He looked around his dining room, the cozy familiarity of it soothing him. Framed photographs lined the walls, each one a snapshot of his life, his family, his friends, the people who truly knew him, who saw him for who he was beyond the color of his skin, or any assumptions made by strangers. Here, he felt anchored, surrounded by reminders of love and support that filled his life in ways strangers couldn't understand or take away. The woman in the parking lot had tried to make him feel small, to diminish him with her assumptions and entitlement. She had spoken to him as though his worth were somehow less than hers, as though she had the right to question his place in the world. But sitting here now, surrounded by pieces of his life and identity, he felt a renewed sense of his own value, a reminder that he was defined not by her ignorance, but by the life he had built. He thought back to the stranger in the parking lot, the man who had stood by him, who had chosen to step in when it mattered most. The more he reflected on that moment, the more he felt gratitude blossoming in his heart. It wasn't just about the video or the support. It was a reminder that there were people willing to do the right thing, even when it would be easier to stay silent. That simple act of solidarity had made all the difference, restoring his faith in the goodness that still existed in the world. Taking a sip of water, he allowed himself to appreciate the meal, each bite grounding him further, easing the remnants of tension. The act of eating, of nourishing himself, felt like an act of self-affirmation, a way of reclaiming his peace and dignity after a day that had threatened to take both away. As he finished his meal, Michael sat back in his chair, taking a moment to savor the calm. Today had been difficult, yes, but it had also been a reminder of his own strength, of his ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. He had faced the confrontation without letting anger consume him, had spoken his truth without backing down, and had walked away knowing that he had done what was right. Rising from the table, he began clearing his dishes, each movement steady and purposeful. The clink of the plates, the rush of water as he rinsed them, the hum of the dishwasher, it all felt like part of a ritual of letting go, a way of washing away the frustrations of the day and making room for the peace he wanted to carry into the night. When he finished, Michael turned off the kitchen light, the house falling into a gentle twilight. He stood for a moment in the quiet, allowing himself to fully embrace the stillness, the sense of safety that his home provided. Today had been a challenge, one that had tested his patience and resolve, but he had come through it stronger, with his dignity intact and his spirit unbroken. And as he made his way to the living room to unwind for the evening, he felt a renewed sense of pride in himself, a quiet but powerful affirmation of his own worth, unshaken by the judgments of others. The world outside might be full of challenges and prejudice, but here in his own space he was safe, strong, and at peace. Michael moved to the living room, the soft warmth of his home wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. The weight of the day had faded into a distant echo, replaced by a calm he had worked to reclaim, piece by piece. Sitting down on his sofa, he picked up the remote, flipping through channels without much interest, letting the background noise fill the quiet spaces of his thoughts. After a few minutes, he settled on an old movie, something familiar and soothing. He leaned back, letting the gentle flicker of the screen pull him into a world far removed from his own. As the scenes unfolded, he found his mind drifting, reflecting on what the day had taught him, on the strength it had taken to stand firm in the face of someone else's prejudice. The woman in the parking lot had tried to strip away his dignity, had tried to reduce him to her limited view of the world, but she hadn't succeeded. In that moment, he had chosen to hold on to his own truth, to refuse to be defined by her assumptions. It was a small victory, perhaps, but a meaningful one. He had shown her, and more importantly himself, that his sense of self was unbreakable, built on a foundation of resilience that couldn't be shaken by a single act of ignorance. He thought again of his parents, of the values they had instilled in him, the lessons in dignity and patience in holding his head high regardless of what others thought. His father's voice echoed in his mind, a steady reminder of the strength he carried within. Respect yourself, son, and others will have no choice but to respect you too. Today, that lesson had guided him, a quiet strength that had seen him through each tense moment. He felt a swell of gratitude for his parents, for their unwavering support, for the wisdom they had passed down. It was a legacy he cherished, one he would carry with him for as long as he lived. As the movie continued, his thoughts drifted to the bystander who had intervened, the stranger who had made a choice to do what was right, to offer his voice when it mattered most. Michael felt a deep appreciation for that man's kindness, for the quiet courage it had taken to step forward. It was a reminder that, while there were people like the woman in the parking lot, there were also those who believed in justice, in fairness, in standing up for what was right. He thought about the impact of that small act of solidarity, how it had changed the course of his day, how it had given him the space to reclaim his dignity. The gratitude he felt was a reminder that, while prejudice and misunderstanding existed, there was still kindness in the world, people willing to see beyond the surface to recognize another person's humanity. The movie played on, the familiar scenes a soothing backdrop to his reflections. He allowed himself to fully unwind, letting go of the remnants of tension, sinking deeper into the comfort of his home. He knew that in the days to come, he might face similar challenges, similar judgments, but tonight he had found a sense of peace, a quiet affirmation that he could carry forward. As the credits rolled, Michael stretched, a gentle sense of fulfillment settling over him. The day had tested him, but he had emerged stronger, grounded in his own truth. He had faced anger and prejudice without letting it break him, had chosen to stand firm, to hold his ground. And in doing so, he had reclaimed his sense of self, a reminder that he was defined not by others' opinions, but by his own resilience and dignity. He turned off the TV, the room falling into a comfortable silence. For a moment, he simply sat there, allowing the calm to fill him, to settle over his heart. Today had been a journey, one that had shown him both the challenges and the beauty of standing in his own truth. As he got up and made his way to his bedroom, Michael felt a renewed sense of clarity, a gentle reminder that, no matter what the world threw his way, he had the strength to face it with grace, to remain unbroken. And with that thought, he felt ready for whatever tomorrow would bring, grounded in the peace he had worked so hard to claim. Michael entered his bedroom, the familiar comfort of the space inviting him to release the last of the day's burdens. The room was filled with warm, muted tones, soft lighting casting gentle shadows across the walls, creating a peaceful atmosphere that wrapped around him like a soothing embrace. He changed into comfortable clothes, setting his phone on the nightstand and feeling the weight of the day ease with each familiar step in his nightly routine. The events of the day still lingered in his mind, like faint ripples on a once calm lake, but he felt stronger now, more centered. His parents' words, the support of the stranger, and his own resilience, all of it had carried him through. And now, in this quiet space, he could finally let go completely, allowing himself to find peace. He pulled back the covers, climbing into bed and sinking into the softness of the mattress. Lying there, He let his thoughts drift, reflecting on the strength it had taken to face today's confrontation. He had stayed calm, had refused to let anger cloud his judgment, and he had spoken his truth even when it felt like the world was poised against him. He thought again of his mother's voice, her unwavering strength, the guiding light that had always grounded him. "Stay true to yourself, Michael. Don't let anyone make you question your worth." It was advice he had leaned on time and again, and today had been no exception. He felt a quiet pride in himself for honoring that advice, for remaining true to who he was, no matter the challenge. As he lay there, he realized that today had not just been a test of patience, but a reminder of the support and strength he had in his life. The stranger in the parking lot, the lessons of his parents, the calm he'd found within himself, all of it had come together to help him navigate the day. It was a reminder that he was not alone in his journey, that there were people who saw him, who valued him for who he was. He closed his eyes, the steady rhythm of his breathing guiding him toward a sense of calm. He knew that, in the days to come, he might face more challenges, more moments when he would need to draw on the resilience within him. But he also knew that he was prepared, that he had a well of strength that could carry him through even the hardest of days. The world outside was filled with noise, with misunderstandings and prejudice, but here, in the quiet sanctuary of his bedroom, he was at peace. He was grounded in his truth, in the knowledge of his own worth, unshaken by the judgments of others. And as he drifted toward sleep, he felt a gentle sense of gratitude for the life he had built, for the people who had helped him along the way, and for the strength that had brought him to this moment. The day's weight had lifted, replaced by a calm, steady resolve. And as sleep embraced him, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that he was not defined by others' perceptions but by his own strength and dignity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, he was at peace, and with that, he let himself rest, the quiet of the night settling over him like a blanket, carrying him gently into dreams filled with hope, resilience, and a deep, unshakable sense of self. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting soft patterns across the walls as Michael slowly opened his eyes, stretching and feeling the gentle warmth of a new day. The heaviness of yesterday had faded, leaving a sense of calm and clarity in its place. He felt lighter, as though sleep had washed away the remnants of tension, preparing him to meet the day with a fresh perspective. He sat up, breathing in the quiet serenity of the morning, the comforting stillness of his home surrounding him. Today was a blank slate, untouched by conflict or frustration, and he was grateful for the chance to begin anew. He moved through his morning routine with a peaceful focus, each small task grounding him, reinforcing the resolve he'd found the night before. As he brewed his coffee, the rich aroma filling the air, he felt a gentle reminder of yesterday's lessons, of strength, resilience, and the support he had found in unexpected places. The memory of the stranger in the parking lot, standing up for him without hesitation, brought a soft smile to his face. It was a small act, but its impact lingered, a quiet reassurance that, even in a world filled with misunderstandings, there were people who saw the truth, who chose compassion over judgment. He poured his coffee, watching the steam rise as he took his first sip, the warmth spreading through him. Each new day brought its own set of challenges and opportunities, but he knew now, more than ever, that he was prepared to meet them. The peace he'd found wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It was a foundation he could carry forward, a reminder of his own inner strength. Stepping onto his porch, Michael looked out at the neighborhood, the familiar sights bathed in the golden light of morning. It was a place he had made his own, a community he belonged to, regardless of anyone else's perception. And today, as he stood there, he felt that belonging deeply, unshaken by yesterday's encounter. As he sipped his coffee, he thought of his parents, of the wisdom they had shared and the values they had instilled in him. He felt a quiet gratitude for their guidance, for the strength they had helped him cultivate. It was a strength rooted not in anger, but in dignity, in the ability to face adversity without losing sight of who he was. Today he carried that strength forward, honoring their legacy and his own journey. The morning air was cool and crisp, filling him with a sense of renewal. He knew he couldn't control how others saw him, couldn't change the minds of those who clung to their prejudices. But he could control his response, his actions, his choices. And that, he realized, was more powerful than any external judgment. He finished his coffee, feeling ready for whatever the day might bring. He had faced the worst of yesterday and emerged with his dignity intact, his spirit unbroken. Today was a new opportunity, a fresh start, and he intended to make the most of it, to live fully and unapologetically in his truth. As he stepped back inside, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him, a calm that came from knowing he was enough, just as he was. He didn't need to prove his worth to anyone else. He had already proven it to himself. And that, he knew, was all that truly mattered. With one last glance at the morning light streaming through the window, Michael moved forward, ready to embrace the day with resilience, gratitude, and an unwavering sense of self. If this story moved you, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We've got more powerful stories coming your way. Stay tuned.